As we meet today, Dan, our country's in the midst of at least three crises. The coronavirus pandemic, what may well be a generational outcry for racial equality and social justice, and an assault on truth that appears to be led by no less than the President of the United States. We call those who dealt with the Great Depression and those in World War II the greatest generation. How would you say we can apply the lessons learned from these folks and some of what you just talked about in setting the gold standard for journalism, and as we go about our business as a country in dealing with this, how can we put these lessons learned to work to help meet the challenges that we're facing today?
Well, I think number one is, even for those of us who think we know the history very well, to stop, read history, and think. Reflect on what happened in the years of the Great Depression leading into World War II and overlapping World War II. The key to the nation holding itself together, first through the Depression, and then later with the end of the Depression and World War II. The key was our ability to pull ourselves together. The ability was, what got us through was our ability to recognize what unites us. There were plenty of things dividing us. The country was divided along a lot of lines, including racial lines, ethnic lines, religion, but the country was able to pull itself together. Now, one thing that made that not only possible, but eventually made it succeed, was the country was well led. I don't want to get into any partisan political situation here, but historians, both domestic and foreign, have recognized that Franklin Roosevelt and his administrations, they saved the Constitution, they saved their party, they saved capitalism, and as a consequence of that, they saved the country. They did it by pulling people together as much as they could. Roosevelt with his fireside chats on radio, which were heard by almost the entire country, that sort of thing. So one, there was intelligent, strong leadership at the top, but a leadership was dedicated to believing and to operating on the basis that the country couldn't pull itself out of the Depression and certainly couldn't fight a big two-ocean world war unless what was emphasized is what unites us. And then the country as a whole recognized that, particularly once we got into World War II, it's easy to forget, in the early stages of World War II, it looked like we could very well lose. The Japanese and the Germans were on the move everywhere. They were rolling back everything and everybody. And most Americans overwhelmingly realized that everything was on the table. That we had our differences, as I said before, over race and so many other things, but that we had to pull together. So and we did. And that's the big lesson out of that period. Now, bringing to today, again, there's no desire here to be partisan political in this, but it's a fact that the leadership, the president, believes that what got him in office, got him elected, was his ability to recognize the divisions in the country and to deal with fear and to take advantage of the divisions. So instead of a uniter, he's been a divider. And that has seeped down the rest of the country. And that we are, extremely divided right now. We're polarized politically as ever. So bringing ourselves to the present time with the pandemic, and how embarrassing, how almost humiliating it is for the United States of America, the leader in science for well over a century, the best medical professions in the world, bar none, the wealthiest country in the world, we have been the worst in meeting the challenge of the coronavirus. And to this time, we can't get ourselves united over anything even as simple as wear a mask or not wear a mask. So I think the lessons out of World War II that we can draw is we have to I would say draw a deep breath, read, think, and recognize what held us together and got us through the Depression and World War II was our ability to overcome our differences and emphasize the things that unite us.
There have been comparisons made of this year to 1968. You were in the center of virtually every major news story that year, from the war in Vietnam to the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, the decision by President Lyndon Johnson not to run for re-election, the protests across the country to end both racial inequality and the war. Do you make a comparison, or could you make a comparison between that turbulent year and 2020?
Yes, I think that there's a comparison to be made, but there's a danger in that. There's some danger of overemphasizing the similarities. I would say 1968 was probably as close to a year like 2020 has been as any we've had. Having said that, it's a different century, a different time. We are in a different country, so one doesn't want to draw too many close parallels. But among the parallels that I think can legitimately be drawn is number one, on race. That much of the violence, much of the protesting in 1968 was based on race. Now, opposition to the war had manifested itself with a lot of protests during the 60s, and there were some still certainly around in 68. But the riots of 1968, and let's remember that there were riots in many major American cities, and that the army, the regular army, had to be called out in some places, Detroit, for example, to quell those riots. But the riots were, the ones that were race-based, were primarily, they were people of color taking part in those riots. The anti-war riots were heavy with younger people and Caucasian people. Now, my reason for raising that is here in 2020, these most recent manifestations in the streets that we've had, these mass protests, have been different from those in 1968 for their diversity. That what struck me the most difference, that these crowds of people protesting in the streets against racial prejudice, crying for justice, were extremely diverse, religiously, ethnically, religiously, and in terms of gender. We didn't see that in the protests, particularly the race protests of 1968. And, that is a major difference. We'll say one other similarity which holds up 1968, that you had a growing disenchantment with the nation's leadership. That people of both parties were, not only mumbling but saying aloud, "Listen, our leadership has really let us down, and we need to make a major change." And of course, a major change was made in the presidential election of 1968 when Richard Nixon was elected. We have yet to see whether in 2020 that the calls and demand for change are met.
You talked about diversity and the big difference being in the protests here, particularly for racial equality, social justice, the diversity today. Do you also get a sense of a sustainability of these protests this year? We've seen over the course of the last several years the really tragic killings of a number of African American young men in different cities, and there were protests, and then the other news superseded the news of those protests. This year, and in the midst of a pandemic, when people are being asked to stay home, these protests have not dissipated. They're continuing, and any protest that started out as including some violence, the protest then turned peaceful, and that diversity was there. Do your instincts tell you that what we're seeing this year may be something different?
Yes, my instincts are sort of whispering that to me. that this year that there may be follow-up, given the nature of these demonstrations. One, given the persistence of them, they've not faded away quickly, and given what we pointed out before, how diverse they are. That's what my instincts tell me. But as you know, and you teach your students all the time, Michael, as a reporter, you follow your instincts, but you don't report your instincts. You'll have to see. My instincts sometimes are right, sometimes are wrong. It's such a complicated and dangerous situation in the country now with this toxic bouillabaisse of dangers to the country, the pandemic, the economic collapse, how else can you say it, combined with a White House that shows all the signs of being dysfunctional, that all of this together makes it very difficult to know whether what we've seen in the streets, which is obviously a reflection of what many people in the country feel, that we need to take some specific and important steps in the direction of doing what we can to reduce racial discrimination. But while my instincts tell me that this time may be different than what we've seen in recent years, and that something concrete may come out of it, it's still hanging out there in the balance. And this election in November will have a lot to say. It may have the decisive say in whether what we've seen in the streets, what we've heard from large sectors of the population about making immediate and rather radical change in so many things, actually results in anything being done or not. Right now, while my instincts tell me that yes, it's going to get done, at least some of it's going to get done, one can't be assured of it.